I got into Nightmare on Elm Street right around the time I was also getting into Friday the 13th. So naturally, the two franchises go together like peanut butter and jelly. I remember sitting in Sunday school, oddly enough, and asking a couple of kids what Freddy sounded like because, unlike Jason, Freddy could actually talk. One kid said he sounded like a darker version of the Shredder. It's interesting because even though Robert Englund plays the character in every film, except for the remake, which I'll get into later, his voice changes with each incarnation. It makes sense that as Freddy got more popular, the filmmakers thought it necessary to bring him out from the darkness and make him more of a wisecracking anti-hero. So he went from sounding dark and ominous to almost like a game show host. We loved Freddy, and probably more so than Jason. We rooted for him to kill because there's a little more humor to him. What sets this series apart from all the other genre slashers is, because the elaborate death sequences take place in dreams, the films take on an aura of fantasy. Because of that, each film brings something new to the table. With Jason, the mythology almost never changed. He drowned as a boy and simply took revenge by killing teenagers who stepped into his wilderness. With Freddy, they actually tried to add to the mythology with each installment. They broke some of their own rules in the process, but you knew with each installment you were going to see something a little different. The original Nightmare on Elm Street could possibly be a contender for best horror movie ever made. I know it's not Psycho or The Exorcist, and some would argue that because it takes place in dreams, it just isn't scary. Think about the imagery, though. The movie opens with a girl roaming around an old boiler room in her nightgown as she's being hunted by an unseen entity who moments before was building a glove with razor fingers. We see the killer's weapon before we actually see the killer. The characters are all likable without being annoying, and it gives us a haunting backstory that makes Freddy a credible threat. The protagonist, Nancy, played by Heather Langenkamp, shows some real strength as the sole survivor, and the movie has an unbelievable hook when we realize that Nancy can take things out from her dream. Director Wes Craven had a real talent for making his films look authentic, and that's something that today's horror remakes just don't capture. Craven's gritty style dates back to 1972's Last House on the Left, was carried over to The Hills Have Eyes, and was still predominant in the original Nightmare. Craven's film was the only one in the series to give us that uncomfortable sense of realism, and because of that, it always seems to stick out a little more. The sequel, Freddy's Revenge, was actually the first one I saw. My mom knew I was getting into horror and actually bought me a used copy of it on VHS. Some would say it's a shame that Freddy's Revenge was the one that introduced me to the series, because it generally isn't looked upon favorably by fans. It features a brand new cast, which is typical for most slasher movies, but the one thing that I think kills it for people is how much it disregards the rules of the first movie. In this one, Freddy acts as an avatar and invades the body of Jesse, this film's protagonist, who moves into Nancy's old house with his family. Although Freddy still has the ability to invade people's dreams, he uses Jesse to do his dirty work for him. At the end of the film, Freddy actually emerges from Jesse's body and starts to wreak havoc at a party. He's out in the open where everyone can see him. At this point, the movie feels much more like your traditional 80s slasher, but damn is it entertaining. This one also has a lot of gay undertones that I simply didn't notice as a kid. There's a scene where Jesse goes to a gay bar. Near the end of the film, he runs away from his girlfriend so he can stay at his buddy's house, and the guy who plays Jesse, Mark Patton, is an openly gay actor. It's been said that the real theme of Freddy's Revenge is a man trying to cope with homosexuality. The filmmakers swear up and down that none of it was intentional, but if you examine it a little further, it's hard to believe anything else. Needless to say, it isn't the best in the series, but it's still a strong installment overall. The third movie, Dream Warriors, is the one most fans remember. While I love the gritty realism and that cloudy sense of mystery in the original, this one took Wes Craven's concept and took it to a new plateau. We once again get a new cast, although Heather Langenkamp returns to play Nancy, this time as a Freddy veteran trying to help a group of social outcasts as they battle Freddy at a mental institution. The effects are extremely elaborate, the dream sequences and the kills are top-notch, and it adds to the mythology by introducing us to Freddy's mother, Amanda. It's disturbing, violent, and fun, and is usually considered the best in the series. By the time Nightmare 4 came out, Freddy was quickly becoming a pop culture icon who was starring in music videos and his own TV series, Freddy's Nightmares. The Dream Master launched the career of director Renny Harlin, who would go on to direct Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger. The fourth film introduced us to the timid Alice, played by Lisa Wilcox, who gains her friend's dream abilities after they're killed off. The movie doesn't add much to the mythology, although it hints a little more at the true root of Freddy's evil. Nightmare 4 is memorable mainly for its pop culture references, like MTV, and its colorful, often eccentric visual style. It generally gets mixed reviews by fans, but was one of the highest-grossing slasher movies at the time. Then came The Dream Child, where Alice, once again played by Lisa Wilcox, accidentally resurrects Freddy through the dreams of her unborn child. With only 3 death sequences and a pretty bland story, the 5th film was easily a low point for the franchise, despite having a couple of stellar effects sequences. Much like how Englund portrayed Freddy in The Dream Master, it was getting too hard to take the character seriously, given his witty catchphrases and game show host personality. This was taken even further into absurdity with Freddy's Dead, where we see Freddy riding on a broomstick before converting his clawed weapon of choice into a Nintendo peripheral. Freddy's Dead was easily the least scary film in the franchise, and wouldn't you know it, this was the origin film, where we find that Freddy actually had a daughter who was taken away from him when authorities discovered he murdered his wife. For a film claiming to be the final nightmare, it had a lot of laughs and not as much blood as its predecessors, but it's still really entertaining. Wes Craven's New Nightmare was the first one I got to see in theaters, and like Jason Goes to Hell, it had to be the one that was a drastic departure from the rest of the series. New Nightmare was a self-referential nightmare film that united many of the cast members from the original movie. The Freddy that we got to know and love from the franchise has figured out a way to break out of the movies and invade our reality, in essence killing off his creators. The only way to stop him is for Wes Craven to make another movie, and for Heather Langenkamp to agree to return as Nancy. Aside from being a paradox of itself, shouldn't the fact that this movie exists be enough to stop Freddy? It doesn't explain how Nancy can come back when she was killed at the end of Nightmare 3. It was a unique idea and plays with the public's infatuation with the character of Freddy Krueger, but when it came out, I had no idea if this was a documentary or an actual sequel. The trailer showed interviews with Wes Craven and even producer Bob Shea, with just a brief tease of Freddy as he appears in the film. Like Jason Goes to Hell, it rewards us by making us wait until the last act to actually see the villain. I've never fully appreciated this one the way that most of the fans have, just because of its seriousness and the fact that it exists outside the canon of the rest of the series. But for curiosity's sake, it's not a bad movie. I've already talked about Freddy vs. Jason in my Friday the 13th podcast, but the one thing I'd like to add is people constantly debate whether it's more of a Freddy movie or a Jason movie. Personally, being a fan of both franchises, I feel that it does a great job playing to both parties. Freddy starts off as the central villain, that much is hard to debate, but as Jason picks up steam, he's pretty unstoppable. And come on, the reason most of us go to see these films is the deaths, and Jason won in this category hands down. Then there's the 2010 remake. I have to at least mention it, so here we go. Like any modern slasher remake, it was unnecessary, and that goes double for Nightmare on Elm Street because they recast Freddy for the first time in the character's career. That takes balls. Once in a while, Hollywood can prove the public wrong, and the most recent example of this is when Heath Ledger knocked everyone's socks off as the Joker. But even in that case, how many people have played the Joker? It was just one more actor giving his interpretation of the character. It's harder when you've had just one actor playing the role for the better part of 20 years. Sometimes you can pull it off, like in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek. And then you have movies like the Nightmare on Elm Street remake, which aren't as successful as they could have been. As a film, it just feels like a carbon copy of the original. It has some of those recognizable locations, like the diner and the prison cell. The opening scene works well when one of the kids gets his throat slashed by Freddy in a boiler room, mirroring the opening scene of the original. But I think they should have waited until midway through the film to reveal Freddy. They reveal him way too early, and there's no real mystery as to what he's going to look like. They had a unique opportunity to shock us because, after all, they were using a different actor for once. Instead, they introduce him at the very beginning, which is a little cheap. The characters are all stock and emotionless. In the original film, the kids were just normal teenagers having a good time, and who just happened to share the same dream. In this film, you feel like everyone carries a certain amount of baggage. There's no fun to be had. Everyone seems to just mope around, waiting for Freddy to kill them. It's a gloomy experience. Don't get me wrong, the original was really dark, but the cast was so much more relatable. As far as Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy, he tried to bring something different to the table, but nothing about his performance stands out. He's not simply imitating Freddy, but at the same time, Robert Englund seemed to have fun terrorizing his victims, and in a certain way, Haley's version is almost creepier. He almost never smiles, and when he taunts his victims, he can sometimes be very chilling. These are all admirable qualities, but it's hard not to miss Robert Englund. There was a reason they kept casting him all those years, and it would have taken an amazing, fresh new talent to come on board and do the role justice. It wasn't Haley's performance that ruined it, though. For some, the makeup was an issue. I didn't mind the new look. I didn't expect them to duplicate what they did before. However, so much of this film copies from the original. It makes you wonder why they left most of the story untouched, but then changed Freddy so drastically. The one plot element they did change was this idea that Freddy might actually be innocent. At first I thought it would have been an interesting twist to make Freddy out to be a victim like Jason. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't help think that sometimes it just works better to believe the guy started out evil. Remember how we viewed Darth Vader before we saw him as a young Anakin Skywalker in the prequels? Evil can work so much better when you don't have a pointless backstory weighing it down. As far as the actual nightmares go, sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. It goes without saying that there's plenty of CGI in this movie, which I usually can't stand in horror movies. With Nightmare, it's a little more forgiving because, after all, most of it happens within the confines of a dream. The best sequences are where they blend CGI with the live action, like the scene where Nancy runs down the hallway and then the floor turns to blood. Then again, you have sequences that flat out rip off the original, like where the girl gets slashed in midair, and where Freddy's glove reaches up out of the water. At first, I gave the movie a little credit for bringing back an original concept when comparing it to all of the recent horror movies of that year. Nightmare was probably the most original concept, and had it not been based off of an immensely popular movie, it might have stood out a little more. On its own, it isn't bad. However, it's trying to capitalize on an iconic slasher villain, and it was annoying how they just couldn't seem to pick a direction to go in. With the Friday the 13th movie, it was almost like they were just making another sequel. Call it whatever you want, but it was a new Jason movie, and that might be because the Friday the 13th films, up until New Line took over, were pretty much doing the same thing over and over. The Nightmare series, on the other hand, was always inventive and always trying to up its game, so when the remake came out and pretty much stole scenes from the original film, that was a little harder to swallow. As a series, I have as much admiration for Freddy as I do for Jason, and I hope they continue to make more. The thing is, you can't just have any actor put on the glove and slash teenagers like you can with Jason. There's a much finer line that needs to be walked, and given Robert Englund's age, we may never get the chance to see the real Freddy in action again. That being said, the original movies are classics in their own right, and you'd be crazy not to see a few of them this Halloween season.